Okay. Check everything. Okay, well, I'm gonna take a second to talk about what I'm trying to do with this in the first place. Several of you already know if you're part of the sort of communities that we were part of before. Some of you are new, so I thought I would just briefly go over like what the point of this is or what I'm trying to accomplish, and then we'll listen to Dirk give his talk, and we'll have some Q&A. So 1 second to share my screen. Okay, so this is the inaugural event of the Agency and Responsibility Research Group. A lot of people have already asked me questions about what is involved in the group. Like, is it a group or members? I don't know. That's all unclear. But this is what I had in mind. So let me just say to all of you, I worked hard to have this acronym. So welcome, all of you. You can't get a good acronym with FW. Turns out it was better with AR than FWMR. So welcome. Hopefully we'll have a lot of these down the road. So the main goal of this was that we had John Martin Fisher created, along with some grad students of his, online community, a blog that I thought was the best group blog on the planet. It was amazing. But after several years, these things have a kind of, they wear down by their own accord. And that's what happened. Sort of its own, it sort of petered out a bit, and John decided he wanted to do it anymore, and he could talk about that. So I opened the Flickers of Freedom, and the thing I tried to change was I added these featured authors. So every month, not every month, but most months, many of you indeed have been featured authors on that blog. And so I did that for several years. There were like 55 featured authors stretched out over multiple years, which was also good, but it had its own problems. There's something that makes group blogs difficult. It's hard to keep everybody interested, and it wears you down if they're constantly posts all the time. So I closed Flickers of Freedom. And like, I think I can speak for a lot of us who were part of those communities. I missed having the space to connect and interact and share ideas. Like when I saw Andre, it has been probably 10 years since I've seen him, and we used to interact online. We might interact on Facebook now, but we used to interact in a philosophically rich way all the time, and now we don't anymore. So I thought, in my eyes, like this is just stage 3 of a process of how to build a community of people who have interests like we do. So this is an extension. It's not some new thing, at least as far as I can tell. It's really an attempt to do the same thing we were trying to do before, just using some new technology to see if we can improve some of the problems we had earlier. And so this is like to connect us together again, which is something I missed, and also to connect us to the public, maybe more than we used to do. So that's the plan. The goal is to sort of use video conferencing like I'm doing now, and social media, and then add a blog element. We'll talk about that later. So the events, just so people know. So for now, we're organizing just individual talks. I'm already in the process of organizing the first roundtable discussion, which I hope to make an announcement soon. I thought we could do workshops. A lot of things we could do, I guess what I want to say. It's a vehicle where we could, if other people especially want to, hey, I want to host a workshop about fill in the blank, like you could do it. Like I can facilitate that on using this as a platform. At least that's what I have in mind. So you could have events for cutting edge empirical research where they present very short talks about the data they've collected. I want to really sort of commit to doing some talks by junior researchers. It's harder for them to get visibility, and have some of the senior people provide them with commentary. So that's sort of the stuff that I'm looking to do. The talks are going to be synchronous, which is what we're doing now, and live stream on YouTube, which is also what we're doing, since not everybody has Zoom. And the talks will be recorded and posted both on the ARRG homepage and the YouTube page. these are just some of the upcoming events. These are all the upcoming events for now. So Christian List is going to speak on Wednesday, October 27th at 1. Carolina Sartorio is going to speak on Friday, December 3rd at 6. And the next semester, we've got John Martin Fisher on Thursday, January 28th at 7. Corey Clark, who's a psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, who does work on the motivated nature of free will belief. I think her stuff's amazing. She's going to speak on Friday, March 25th. And then finally, Dana Nelkin will speak on Thursday, April 28th at 7. I have no idea how many people are going to come to these things. This year is just a trial run to see how much interest can be generated, how many people want to do this sort of stuff. Now, I'll change it a little bit because I wasn't sure how many people were going to show up, and I had a worry that people would be who would want to like blurt out and not be like it would be too unruly. We have few enough people that you'll just be able to use the hand raise function. I wasn't sure, so I purposely tried to make it so that in the event there were a bunch of people, I didn't want just a zillion hands going up. So we'll just use the hand raise function for the purpose of today, and then at the end, we'll just you can use that, and I can either help pick questions for Dirk, or he can select the questions himself. I've posted a link in the chat to a survey that I did just for the talk. And as I explained in the chat, like it's really just like, who are you? Where are you from? What's your connection to philosophy? What do you think about the free will debate? And what would you like to see? Like what kind of events would you like? What kind of talks would you like to bring in? If you're interested in being involved somehow or giving a talk, you can give me your contact information there. So please take a second to do that. So after the event, the recorded will be posted. As I said, we posted. Now this is the part that I haven't talked as much about. And the idea is that post will serve as a discussion thread for people who missed the talk or still have ideas they would like to discuss with one another about the talk. So there will still be a blog element. I'm only going to leave these discussion threads open for a week. I could explain why if we had more time. If you're curious, you can email me. I think John knows as well as I do through the background. It has to do with like how hard it is to get people to engage with these things and just make them really long when people aren't interested in trying to like keep up with them. So everyone's welcome to participate in these threads. I will send the speakers a link so that if speakers want to participate in the thread, they're certainly welcome to do so, but it is no doubt viewed as something supererogatory. That's not something they agree to do or I've even asked them to do. I don't even expect them to do it, but if they want to do it, they can. And then those will close. And so that's how the sort of what's going to happen after the fact. Also, if there are questions in the chat thread, I will pass those along to the speakers as well. Like at the end, if there are more questions that we don't have time for, but you'd like, for instance, Dirk to know what your question was, I can export the chat thread and then send it to the authors as well. So that are the speakers. That's something else I'll be able to do. So that said, on with the show. So as all of you know, Dirk Pereboom is the Susan Lynn Sage Professor of Philosophy and Ethics in the Department of Philosophy at Cornell. It's not here, but his book, Living Without Free Will, is one of my very favorite books in philosophy. It had a profound effect on how I thought about agency and responsibility, a profound and lasting effect. It's partly why, and we're often in the minority in these circles, people who have these very skeptical views towards agency and responsibility. And so I thought it was fitting, given the impact that he's had on me, if I gave him the opportunity to speak to us about his new book, Wrongdoing and Moral Motions, which just came out. So please get a copy and read it for yourself. Here, Pereboom provides an account of how we might effectively address wrongdoing, given challenges to the legitimacy of anger and retribution that arise from ethical considerations and from concerns about free will. And I'll assume the talk is part of that latest book. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dirk Pereboom.
Thomas, thanks very much for organizing the series of events and inviting me to be the speaker. And it's great to see you all. I've seen a lot of you before. I guess I see some new faces. Anyway, it's great to be here to discuss this new book. I actually go beyond the book to a certain extent in discussing. So one thing the book does is it advances a forward-looking theory of moral responsibility. I've done that in the past, but I develop in a lot more detail in the book than I have in the past. One contrast here is with other forward-looking views, and Manuel Vargas is in the audience. I don't know if Dan Dennett's here. They've also argued for forward-looking views, as have others of you in the audience, but mine differs in certain key respects from from most other versions of forward-looking views, and I want to highlight those differences and argue for my view against the opposition. Okay, so as in the other stuff I've done on free will, I think of free will as the, well, I guess I changed my mind a little bit about this. I used to think that there was just one controversial notion of free will, and that's the control and action required for basic desert responsibility. But now I'm starting to think that it's important to say, and I guess I've thought this implicitly in the past, that alternative possibilities free will is also controversial and important, and I've kind of developed a new position on that. Not so much to a certain extent in this book here, but they asked me to do this Cambridge element series on free will, and that's going to come out soon. And there I actually side with the view that we do have free will, at least a pretty significant sort of free will of the alternative possibility sort. So I suppose in that way, my view's been revised. But in this book here, I focus on basic desert free will. And as a result of the intervention of some of you, including, let's see, Michael McKenna, for example, I've changed my characterization of basic desert. It kind of fits better with the themes of this book. So the new, now it's kind of stayed the same for 20 years, but it's a bit different now. Now it focuses on pain and harm and pleasure and benefit being basically deserved, by contrast with, say, blame and praise being basically deserved. For several reasons, I didn't really like that earlier formulation. I think the new formulation is better. So the new formulation goes like this: for an agent to be more responsible for an action in the basic desert sense is for the action to be attributable to her in such a way that if she is sensitive to its being morally wrong, she would deserve to be blamed or punished in a way that she would experience as painful or harmful. And if she was sensitive to its being morally exemplary, she would deserve to be praised or rewarded in a way that she would experience as pleasurable or beneficial. And then again, the desert at issue is basic in the sense that in the case of blame, the agent would deserve such pain or harm just by virtue of having performed the action with sensitivity to its moral status. Okay, so that's the key notion. The control and action required for basic desert responsibility and basic desert blame in particular is one of the foci of this new book. So some reasons, just to review some reasons to reject basically deserve pain and harm. One is to basically deserve to be blamed or punished in a way that imposes pain or harm, an agent must have a kind of control and action, a type of free will that's unavailable to us. And, I've argued it for that conclusion at length in both the 2001 and 2014 books and in other places. And I won't review those arguments here. And then Michael McKenna has pointed out that basically deserved harm is best characterized as a non-instrumental good. And in general, I suppose one might wonder whether harm can ever qualify as a non-instrumental good. And that's another reason to be concerned about basically deserved blame as I define it. Okay, the third concern is epistemic. Justification for imposing harm must meet a high epistemic standard. And if it's significantly probable that one's justification is unsound, then at least prima facie, that imposition of harm is wrong. And that's a theme that I've pressed in the area of the discussion of treatment of criminals. And both Ben Vilhauer and Greg Caruso have nice papers developing that thought. Okay, so if you reject backward-looking blame of this sort, you can accept forward-looking blame. You can accept forward-looking praise as well. And so I've looked to moral protest accounts of blame as for a characterization of blame in this forward-looking sense. And this view is well represented in the literature. So Pamela Hieronymi has a great paper in PPR back in 2001, arguing for the moral protest account of blame. Matt Talbert, Angela Smith, all developed moral protest accounts of blame. So mine differs in the, so Pamela, for example, argues that blame as moral protest involves resentment and at least resentment or indignation. And I at least want to argue that that there is a good conception of the moral protest account of blame that to which or for which resentment and indignation are not essential. In fact, moral anger in no sense is essential to this notion of blame. Okay, I'll talk about that a bit. Moral protest, in my view, is it's kind of like John has a view of John Fisher has a view of moral responsibility as reasons responsive, and I kind of build reasons responsiveness into blame itself. So moral protest, on my view, involves presenting moral reasons to the wrongdoer, moral reasons to behave differently than the way in which the agent behaved. And I also think that this protest may be more or less confrontational, depending on the context. And in this respect, I suppose I'm at least given David Shoemaker's definition in his 2015 book of accountability. So you may think of me as assigning on to accountability, even though I don't sign on to basic desert or resentment or indignation, since I think that moral protest can be more or less controversial, and it's justified in being confrontational by certain kinds of circumstances. So the view is forward-looking because the justification I endorse for blaming, I'd say it's largely forward-looking. So Randy Clark made the point that it might even be a conceptual truth that blame is only appropriate if the agent actually did wrong, and that's a backward-looking consideration, something I accept. But for the rest, the justification I endorse for blaming is forward-looking. So it includes justifications like protection from harmful immoral behavior, reconciliation with those who have done wrong, moral formation or moral education of those disposed to do wrong, and the retention of integrity of the victims of wrongdoing. Right, so lots of people think that resentment and indignation are essential to blame following Strawson, and I deny this for the reason that I think that there are, well, I have a number of reasons, but one set of reasons concerns the fact that there are cases of blameworthiness that are not plausibly cases of, in David Shoemaker's terminology, angerworthiness. Okay, I got a few examples here. So imagine a parent. Suppose Athena is a parent and her teenage children misbehave in minor, common, predictable ways. They squabble, fail to clean their rooms, text their friends when they should be sleeping. Some parents would respond with anger, but Athena doesn't, and instead responds from the sense of the duty to morally educate. She's a Kantian parent. Okay? She's not a utilitarian, but a Kantian. She thinks she's got the duty to morally educate. But she responds with moral protest, mild moral protest, not involving a lot of confrontation here. And you might think in these kinds of cases, given the nature of the wrongdoing, the anger response is at best optional, and maybe in some cases inappropriate and ineffective. And I'll talk about ineffectiveness later on in the discussion. Another case is, imagine Basil, a high school teacher, whose students often misbehave in common ways. They come unprepared for not having done the assigned reading, distract the classmates by talk not related to class material, surf the internet instead of participating and paying attention. So Basil responds with protest, engaging his students constructively, giving them moral reasons and prudential reasons to behave differently, but not with anger. Okay? So in this case, at least one might argue that in a lot of these kinds of circumstances, the anger response stands to be counterproductive and to undermine forward-looking effectiveness and respect. And some evidence for this is that in these kinds of cases, if teachers do express anger, parents, visit the school and criticize and complain about the teachers being too angry. Okay, so what about professors like us and administrators? I got this senior associate dean's job, and I take a lot of hassle from faculty members. Maybe if you get angry, maybe that would help, right? But maybe not. Okay? So imagine Chloe is an administrator who at times faces these sorts of issues with her colleagues. Imagine she responds not with anger, but calmly with arguments that invoke the wider moral considerations. So maybe it's a case. So Martha Nussbaum makes this point as well in her discussion of anger in her book on this, that in a lot of cases like this, anger is not effective. And you might know about this from your own context, that if administrators get angry at meetings, this is remarked upon and sometimes thought of as a weakness, and in the long term not so effective. Okay? So these are cases of blame in which, at least arguably, anger, we have blameworthiness, but we don't clearly have anger worthiness, but we still have protest worthiness. So I want to identify blameworthiness with protest worthiness as opposed to, say, anger worthiness. Okay, so another feature of this Wrongdoing in the Moral Emotions book is that when I talk about forgiveness, I characterize forgiveness not as Butler did, as renunciation of resentment, but rather as renunciation of moral protest. Okay, so I developed that in the 5th chapter of the new book. Okay, so this doesn't mean that anger is generally illegitimate. And in the 3rd chapter of the book, I have a kind of a long discussion of defensive harming and the kinds of emotions that appropriately accompany defensive harming. And I gave this talk at West Point about a few years ago, and there's the ethics teacher there at West Point Military Academy is really interested in philosophy and in the ethics of war and moral responsibility. And I asked him what he thinks about the right sorts of emotions to have in warfare, when soldiers are in danger. And so he wrote to me and he said, when it comes to emotions in battle, I'd label them as fear prior to fight, fury during the fight, and a combination of relief, satisfaction, and sadness after the fight. When soldiers are out to get payback after a casualty, the list would be anger, fury, satisfaction. The fury is controlled. It's not raging. It's focused determination and energy. It's a them or us competition where nothing else matters for the time being. Measured aggression is a term I've heard used. Right? So in that 3rd chapter, I defend measured aggression as a legitimate emotion. So the measured aggressive stance, I argue, is normatively measured in the sense that the degree of aggressive emotion should be proportional to the defensive task at hand. And so its intensity should not exceed what's appropriate to the task. And while the stance does not presuppose that the target of aggression deserves or basically deserves to be harmed, it may, as I'm envisioning it, presuppose that the aggressor is wrongly posing a threat. And it would plausibly qualify as a kind of moral anger. The thing is that people in warfare, you don't know enough about the opposition to know whether they basically deserve to be harmed. But I think you may know that they're on the wrong side, at least if you're on the right side. So you may know that they're wrongly posing a threat, and the measured aggressive stance would be appropriate in circumstances of that sort. Okay, so I want to argue for this forward-looking view, not a backward-looking view. So let me characterize the kind of two competing forward-looking views of moral responsibility. I'm going to focus on blame as opposed to praise. So there's the undivided view, which is the view that I want to advocate for. And then there's the 2-tier view, which Manuel Vargas endorses. And I think Daniel Dennett also endorses, although he wrote me recently saying that he's not totally sure he's on that side, but I've always thought he was on that side. So I'm going to just focus on Vargas as opposed to Dennett, because Vargas is out there endorsing the 2-tier view. So the 2-tier view, like one really nice version of it for law was articulated by John Rawls when he was over here at Cornell in his early career in this article, Two Concepts or Rules, where he imagines that lawyers and judges think of more responsibility in the criminal context just in terms of desert. But the desert's not basic because it's justified at a higher level by utilitarian principles. Right? So it turns out that you've got two levels, sometimes called government house utilitarianism. You got 2 levels. There are a bunch of possible practice, kind of a practice level consequentialism. So there are lots of different possible practices. And then you ask, like, which practice works best for people? And Rawls imagines that in the case of criminal law, the practice that works best for people is if people think of crime and punishment just in terms of desert and not in a consequentialist or forward-looking way. But at the same time, the justification for that practice level, for that practice, is consequentialist at a higher level. And John Doris, in his review of Manuel's Building Better Being suggests that Manuel has a view like this, except it's expanded to all of moral responsibility, and Manuel, in his response to John, agrees with this. Okay, so on Manuel's view, the main point of the practice of holding morally responsible is to build better beings. There are other, I think he'd agree that there are other points as well, but that's the main aim of the practice. And on his account, and this is in his reply to John Doris's comment on his book in Phil Studies back in 2015, he wants to say that it's our actual practice, much as we now find it, that's justified on forward-looking grounds. And he calls this a kind of conservatism about the practice. So you might think that the right sort of forward-looking view is a two-tier view that's conservative with respect to the practice, because the practice more or less gets it right. He doesn't say it gets it completely right. He thinks that there are problems, for example, with Texas-style retributivism, but more or less gets it right. This goes back to maybe a certain kind of British sentimentalist tradition that we see in Strawson. At least I think I see in Strawson, people like Edmund Burke or Hume, according to which the practice of holding morally responsible is a not particularly malleable result and expression of human beings as constituted by their relatively fixed natures. It's a salutary practice. It's a complex system, given our natures, does fine work in regulating human actions, attitudes, dispositions, to the benefit of all. And the idea is that there's maybe some room for change in the practice of holding morally responsible, but justified change is limited. And part of the idea is that, and this is certainly in Hume, human nature is more or less fixed. It's not very malleable. And then it's also important to respect the kind of practices that have evolved over history, given human nature. And one shouldn't think that justified change is justified change is possible, but large-scale justified change is not likely. Okay, so what Manuel says is this about his view. He says it's a potentially revisionist nature. His approach has a potentially revisionist nature. It's revisionist to the extent that the result of prescriptive philosophical theorizing may conflict with folk commitments. He says the project is fundamentally conservative. On this approach, the main issue is whether our existing practices are justified and whether typical judgments of moral responsibility are true. And then Manuel says he wants to allow for some revision, but not for much. And I quote, "I've argued that the crucial issue is whether there are many or any cases where our practices and judgments are such that my position can't provide an adequate normative basis. It's not clear what such a case would be. Let's suppose that there are some such cases, perhaps, for example, the Texas death penalty attitudes and practices can't persist without some form of desert that can't be recast along the two-tiered lines I've endorsed. If so, it's difficult to see how these cases could be widespread." Okay, so there are such cases, perhaps, but they're not widespread. So here's one of my problems with the two-tiered view. It's related to the conservatism. I guess I'm opposed to the conservatism because I think that the practice is, for one thing, I think it's quite malleable, and I think that it has changed quite a lot over the years, especially the last, say, 100 years. And this change has been really good. Okay, but I think that the two-tiered position that Manuel and Daniel Dennett endorse actually facilitates the conservatism. Why? Because on the two-tier view, the practice is insulated to a certain extent, maybe to a very significant extent, from the forward-looking considerations that ultimately justify it. Okay? So if one's thinking of more responsibility solely in terms of desert, and the forward-looking considerations are there just at the government house level, then the practitioners are insulated from those forward-looking reasons. And that's something that I don't favor, right? Because I think those forward-looking reasons are important. I mean, they're after all the reasons that justify the practice. And they would also be the reasons that justify revision of the practice. Okay? So I think there's a worry about the two-tier view that results from the fact that the ultimate justifiers of the practice are, or at least the practitioners are insulated from the ultimate justifiers of the practice, i.e. the forward-looking reasons. By contrast, on my undivided view, those who blame legitimately have forward-looking objectives such as moral formation, reconciliation, and protection as their explicit aims. And in blaming, they don't impose pain or harm that they conceive as basically deserved or as deserved at all. And the pain of blaming is not conceived by the blamer as a non-instrumental good imposed in blaming, but as an instrumental good in service of those forward-looking goals. There may be pain in blaming, but the blamer thinks of the pain of blaming as an instrumental good that subserves the forward-looking goals of blame. So I think here's one thing that Manuel and Dennett would both agree with, at least in principle, that conservatism is justified only if there's no form of the practice available to us that does substantially better at securing the forward-looking goals. And I want to propose that the undivided view does better. So I think that my view requires that there are problems for the practice that an alternative would correct, and that human beings are sufficiently malleable for to allow for adoption of such an alternative. So I've got to argue for malleability against people like Strawson and Hume, and then that our practice would do a lot better at achieving the forward-looking goals if it were revised. Okay, so what about variability? It's hard to argue, but there are quite a few studies out there about the variability of human nature, and there's in the paper I have on this, I cite this study, this meta study by Dallaire, Snyder, Boyger, and Mesquita on studies on cultural variation of emotions, and it turns out to be quite significant. They focus on difference in relationship emotions between East Asians and Americans. And also, there's this the study of Inuit tribe by Jean Briggs in 1970. She went to live with them for a whole year, and there were kind of marked differences in emotional tendencies between the community Jean Briggs came from, i.e. An academic community in Canada, and the Inuit. And the one marked difference was that the Inuit in this particular group hardly ever showed anger, right? And they trained their kids not to show anger. And she's got hypotheses about why they should be. And I'm not arguing that the East Asian way of being in this respect or the Inuit way of being is better. I'm just arguing at this stage is that it does appear from these studies that human nature is emotionally malleable, by contrast with these themes that we see in some of the people that I just mentioned. Okay, so what about revision? So I'm kind of focusing on moral anger here, and I think that while, as Dave Shoemaker points out, there are a lot of benefits of anger, there are also harmful effects of anger, and I want to focus on the harmful effects because I think it can be mitigated by the right sort of revision of the practice. So there are lots of studies on this. I just want to cite a few. One is this, that desert presupposing confrontational moral anger poses a threat to personal relationships due to the alienating effect expressions of such anger have on others, and from anger's propensity to occasion defensive or offensive reaction rather than reform and reconciliation. So apparently what gets found is that when an anger response, how do teenagers react to a parent's anger response? Well, sometimes it's offensive, they'll rebel, and sometimes there'll be a defensive response. But what does the angry response have the best chance of achieving the forward-looking goal of moral reform? Well, not if it has too strong a tendency to occasion defensive or offensive reactions. So that's a concern, and it's a concern that gets studied in the literature. So a candidate reason why the practice malfunctions in personal and societal relationships is that the motions it recruits are in tension with other requirements for the stability of these relationships. So in circumstances of conflict, stability requires that participants believe the truth concerning the pertinent emotional attitudes and behavior of others. You got to get it right. Otherwise, discussions about moral responsibility don't work out very well. But Mark Alecki and his collaborators over the years have argued that on the basis of studies that subjects who evaluate the actions of others unfavorably and blame them as a result readily exaggerate the putative wrongdoers' causal control and the evidence that might favor it, while at the same time discounting the counter evidence. So Alecki calls this tendency blame validation. Okay? So you validate blame by believing falsehoods about the target of your blame. So one concern here is that anger is part of the problem here. And here there are a number of studies. Julie Goldberg is the one I cite in the paper. So in kind of a meta study she does, she concludes that anger results in a tendency to overlook circumstances that would serve to mitigate blame, enhances the disposition to view ambiguous behavior as hostile, strengthens the proclivity to rely on stereotypes about irrelevant features such as race and ethnicity, and heightens the probability of agents discounting the role of uncontrollable factors in assessing responsibility for wrongdoing. So in one of their studies, Julie Goldberg and her associates conclude that when retributive desires to harm are not satisfied, anger activates an indiscriminate tendency to punish others in unrelated situations without regard for whether their actions were intentional. So in the title of the book, I talk about the backfire effect, and I got interested in this because some of my colleagues here in the government department did a study on attempts to kind of intervene in a certain way in the where the targets were people who believed that this last election was stolen, and they found out that the mode of intervention actually resulted in an increase of credence in the belief that the election was stolen. Right? And so this is an example of the backfire effect. Well, this backfire effect I think that the term originated back in 2010, and it was introduced by Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler. So the way they characterize the backfire effect is as an identity protective action that responds to belief-threatening refutation messages in a way that results in a higher credence in the targeted belief. You can also think of the backfire effect as pertaining to actions and not just beliefs. So if you target an action in a certain kind of way through an intervention, it may be the case that the incidence of the actions actually increased as opposed to decreased. That would be the backfire effect relative to action. So there's a couple of researchers, social scientists, Feike Haring and Gerben van Cleef. They argue on the basis of a number of studies that, well, at least in the short term, anger is effective in conflicts about interests. Right? So in conflicts about interest, anger is effective. It's not effective in conflicts about values. So when the intervention concerns values, anger turns out to occasion the backfire effect, they argue, i.e. an outcome in which value beliefs targeted for revision are strengthened, not weakened by the interaction. The studies also provide evidence that people regard expressions of anger as more unfair in value conflicts than in interest conflicts, and also that we're more likely to engage in retaliatory responses when confronted with an angry attempted refutation in a value conflict. Okay, so what's the solution here? So psychologist Gregory Travers and his associates proposed that to counter the backfire effect, messages should be framed in ways that activate self-conceptions amenable to processing the message with the intended revision. And so in the example they cite, if the communication intent to educate about the safety of genetically modified foods is framed by dietary, which foods are natural and which are unnatural, self-conceptions regarding valuation of dietary purity may be activated, triggering a backfire effect. However, if such communication is instead framed by the value of feeding the world's hungry, self-conceptions relating to generosity and compassion tend to be activated, precluding the backfire effect and increasing the likelihood of the intended belief revision. Okay, so this has perhaps suggestive implications for how to intervene in the case of behavior as opposed to beliefs that we want to target for revision. I think it's very important, especially in the current context, because if you look at the internet, I mean, there's just so much, there's so much division in our in kind of political and on political and social issues, and the divisions don't seem to be very constructive from the forward-looking point of view. It's not as if people on one side are saying, oh, I'm being targeted by this other group, so I'm going to change my views, I'm going to change my behavior. Rather, it seems that the conflicting camps are kind of stick with their views, and not a lot of belief revision seems to be going on. I'm not sure of that, but that's how it seems to me if I look at the internet. Okay, so so the suggestion is then that maybe angry blame in the case of political views and social views you don't like isn't the way to go, because it's not the way to change people's minds and to change people's behaviors, because it triggers the backfire effect. So rather, in political discourse, framing communication with shared values and common social and economic concerns may in these contexts achieve value change and avoid the backfire effect. Something to keep in mind. Look, the intended change isn't always going to be attainable, but maybe such strategies will achieve enough mutual understanding to resolve the extreme sorts of divisions that we now see. So I think these issues are crucial going forward, especially given what's being thought about, stuff like climate change, the nature of our political systems. So in reacting to the views we disagree with, we readily express angry blame, but in the view of the backfire effect, if the intent is to change hearts and minds in the long term, the expression of angry blame is often at odds with these goals. And so, and this is an illustration, I think, of why the undivided view is good, because if you don't have the undivided view, you've got the two-tier view, you're going to kind of stick with current practice. And there's a concern that you just stick with angry blame in these kinds of cases, but the angry blame then has the backfire effect, which is counterproductive relative to the forward-looking goals of the practice of holding morally responsible. So in this kind of case, I think it's better to have the undivided view, because that makes the practitioner sensitive, immediately sensitive to the forward-looking reasons and to the concerns that are raised by the possibility of the backfire effect, for example. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dirk. Sorry, it took me a second to transition. Okay, so there are people with questions. And so I don't know if I can see them all. Let me get off of the speaker view to gallery view where it's easier for me to see them. Okay, so I saw one by Eddie and then another by John. Good to see you guys too. This whole thing is amazing. This is the blog, we couldn't see one another. I mean, there are a lot of virtues to it, but I couldn't see you all. So that's awesome. So so I'll start with Eddie, I guess, and then I saw John, then Dave. Let's do it that way. Hold on.
There's Eddie. Can we hear him?
No, I can't hear him, but he should be able to.
He's muted. Eddie, you're muted.
No, that part's true, but I don't know why he can't unmute himself.
He's pointing at us.
Eddie, why are you pointing? There we go. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, now you can unmute yourself.
That was my terrible sign language to say Thomas has to unmute me, but sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks again for hosting this, Thomas. You really have put together a remarkable series of things. You didn't even mention the online philosophy conference you invented. So this is a wonderful new addition to the series of innovations. Thanks, Dirk, for your wonderful talk. This is mostly a question of clarification about the difference between the two-tiered view, or what you mean by the two-tiered view. I'm thinking of it in terms of the analogy Dennett uses, and maybe Manuel uses too with sports. You create the rules in order to make the game most effective and enjoyable for the players and fans, and then you enforce them in a backwards looking way. And it sounded like you were suggesting that that would mean that the participants in the game might not understand the overall forward-looking functions of the rules. And that doesn't seem true in most games. They understand why the rules are there in general, but it still seems most effective to enforce them in the backward-looking way. So maybe I was misunderstanding. And then if you get around, don't take my second question to answer till other people have had a chance, but I'll put it on the table if you want to answer questions about the type of view that Srivasan raises about the value of anger in sort of context of injustice and the problems with suggesting that it's not appropriate to allow people who have been discriminated against and harmed to tell them that they shouldn't be angry. But you can leave that for later if there's time.
No, and given that you put that question on the table, I have to answer that one too, because that's a good challenge. Okay, so it's not that you misunderstood. The first question is apt. So I definitely believe the two-tier view as Dennett and Manuel characterize it for sports. And look, I mean, maybe it may be the right way to go in the legal context as well, at least certain aspects of the legal context. Maybe not sentencing, I don't know, but it might be valuable to have the system of rules and the application of those rules in those kinds of contexts insulated from the forward-looking reasons. After all, you don't want the referees considering the general forward-looking reasons for having rules in sports when they're making a call on a possible offside situation, for example. Right. So they're going to be context, I think, in which it's valuable to maintain that division. But I do think that there are lots of contexts, and I think that typical moral contexts, like interpersonal moral contexts, are like this, in which it's important not to have the division between the upper tier and the lower tier for the reasons I cited, namely that it's important that the practice and also the blaming itself, the blaming in the context, be sensitive to the forward-looking considerations. So I agree that I think that the sports analogy is apt, and I think that it may actually hold for certain kinds of legal contexts. But in the kinds of contexts I was discussing in the paper, I want to say that it's important not to have the division, because it's important to have the practice be directly sensitive to the forward-looking considerations. And then on your second question, anger. So, I guess I think that that's right. I discuss this in the third chapter of the book when I discuss, the measured aggressive stance, and I'll talk about injustice, and I use some of the stuff that McAllister Bell raises in her book on contempt in this context. So I guess I want to say, look, I mean, the thing is that I guess I think that I'm not 100% sure about this anymore, because Dave Shoemaker was pushing me on this issue. I used to hold that resentment and indignation had basic desert presuppositions. I don't know if I can really defend that claim. I think a lot of times they do, but I've got to worry about basic desert. So I think that resentment, indignation often have false presuppositions. But look, a false presupposition may be trumped by certain kinds of practical considerations. So there might be certain kinds of considerations in which one's oppressed or injustice is at stake, in which one just gets very indignant, and that indignation may, in my view, have a false presupposition. But look, I mean, it may be better practically to have the indignation than to avoid the false presupposition by not being indignant. Now, I do think that there are substitute attitudes here, like the measured aggressive stance and blame as protest. But look, I mean, if somebody is indignant, the fact that it has a false presupposition isn't something that rules it out as morally inappropriate. Who's next? John.
Is it me?
Yeah.
So I'm of a certain age, so I have to start by asking, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much to Thomas and to Dirk. Quickly, I've always wondered, on your view, whether considerations about, the consequences, the forward-looking consequences versus backward-looking considerations like desert, whether those reflections were simply meta reflections or second-order reflections on what justifies the practice, or whether those second-order reflections actually, in your mind, have an effect or should have an effect on the practice. It should change them. So I wasn't clear about that, but it seems that you do believe that whether you adopt a forward-looking or a backward-looking approach to the justification of practices will entail something about the nature or the degree of reaction. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Okay.
Thanks. I've never articulated my answer to the question you're asking now, which I should really have done. But given that everything's determined, I couldn't have done it anyway, right? So I'll do it now. Back in Living Without Free Will days, my aim back then was to see if we could do without desert, right? To basically kind of sketch a picture of moral practice that didn't involve basic desert at all. Okay? So that was one kind of theoretical objective. Okay, but what we're talking about now is a bit different. So in the controversy with Manuel and Dan Dennett, the issue is a bit different because, here's one way to see it. We both agree, suppose we agree on all the forward-looking objectives of the practice of holding morally responsible. So at this point, the question becomes like, how do we best achieve those forward-looking objectives? Now I'm arguing in this talk that it's not by insulating desert considerations in the mind of the practitioners from the forward-looking considerations. It's rather, at least for a kind of a broad swath of kinds of cases, the practitioner should have the forward-looking reasons in mind. So I argue that that scheme better realizes the forward-looking goals. Okay, so I suppose here's one way of seeing your question. Suppose that it turns out that Manuel's conservatism does just a bit better than my undivided view at realizing the forward-looking goals. Now, at that point, do the considerations of desert weigh in favor of my view? And I guess I want to say that, should I be Kant here and say that the practical considerations reign supreme here, that Manuel's view then wins out practically? I guess I want to say that. I'll say that now. How about that? Just for, I haven't thought about this enough, but I think I would say that given those circumstances, Manuel would be right and I'd be wrong.
Let me ask, if I may, this was really a conjunction, my question, so please indulge it. I really, on my own view, I don't really have a dog in this race. That is, I don't really care so much whether we justify or conceptualize responsibility in a forward-looking way or a backward-looking way or a hybrid. It doesn't really matter to me. What I want to argue crucially is that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, even if we don't have freedom to do otherwise. I never really, have figured out whether I feel that there has to be this retributive component, backward-looking component to responsibility. But then again, I'm not completely convinced by your and Manuel's and other views. Really go back to the utilitarians and J.J.C. Smart, that punishment gets conceptualized and justified purely in forward-looking ways. And the reason I have a problem is, it doesn't seem to capture this idea that I think is very deep in human nature, that certain, people who've violated the norms, moral or legal norms, deserve a reaction that in some way fits the crime. And what I want to say is, if you look at the actual human beings and their behavior, for instance, human beings who have lost loved ones to serial killers, or, in the Twin Towers, or their daughters or spouses or even sons have been raped, they almost always want closure. And if there isn't a significant reaction based on the desert of those violators or norm breakers, people don't feel that there's been closure. I mean, there are people who wait at San Quentin prison, and they might have lost a loved one 10 years before to a murderer, and they wait, and because they want closure. So I don't know whether you just want to say those people are not nice, those people are bad, or they're giving into their base instincts, and you point to the Inuit or certain cultures where there isn't this retributive instinct. But I still think something's missing. And in a way, you're trying to be Mr. Nice Guy. Or you're not trying to, you are genuinely nice, but then you're benefiting from the impression that the rest of us are not as nice, and, not deliberately. And so the last thing I'll say is, when you talk about the backfire effect, there are countervailing considerations, of course. And I just want to say, when you suppress or repress a natural emotion, it's not necessarily psychologically healthy. And I'm going to just end by citing a comedian who, is much on the outs these days because he was a bad guy in various ways, Woody Allen, who said, "I don't grow angry, I just grow a tumor."
Right. Great. Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah. So I think that I would agree that if our retributive instincts are as you describe them, that would be a kind of strong reason to go maybe Manuel's way or Dan Dennett's way, and to retain the desert justifications for harsh treatment of criminals. But, Greg Caruso has got this new book called Rejecting Retributivism, and he discusses this objection. And if you look at these societies where treatment of criminals is not retributive, like where I came from, i.e. the Netherlands, and certain Scandinavian, I guess all the Scandinavian countries, including Finland now, where retributive justifications aren't really invoked for treatment of criminals. So I guess you have to ask about the societies. What happens if people lose loved ones? I mean, is it really intolerable? Is it the case that they don't achieve closure? Or are there other ways of achieving closure than through retribution? I mean, if you look at like South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, I mean, that at least proposed a way of reconciling adversaries that didn't involve retribution. So I think it's natural to think that only through retribution do we achieve closure in these situations, and certainly emotionally. When I imagine myself in a situation like this, it's something that I think that I would want, retribution exacted. But at least there's some empirical evidence that in places in which justification for criminal treatment is not retributive, it's not as if closure can't be achieved. But that's an empirical issue. But at least that would be the kind of the response to your question that I would explore. Let's see.
I got to unmute myself. So Dave was next, and then Manuel, and then Paul.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for doing this. Of course, this is just fantastic. We're so much appreciated, and Dirk for doing this as well. And I've had plenty of opportunities to talk to you, Dirk, about a lot of this project. The book is fantastic, folks, so you've got to get this book. But I did want to ask something that I'm not sure.
Hey, David, you got muted somehow.
Very odd. Okay, I'm
I
back
don't know how
now.
that happened. Sorry. Yeah.
That's very strange. So yeah, there seem to be some cases in which protest without any kind of angry emotion just doesn't seem to rise to blame. And so one example, so this example I gave in the chat question, and that Manuel and I have talked about before. Sister Helen Prejean stands in front of the prison with the lit candles, and there's an execution that night, and she's clearly protesting the execution, but she's also explicitly saying, "I'm not blaming anybody here. I just want to protest this." And so, and you could think also, one of your examples was parents, but you can think of just the kids running through the house, and you say, "Come on, whoa, 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 guys, cut it out, cut it out, cut it out," and that doesn't seem to me to rise to blame, although you're surely protesting the activities that are going on there. So it had seemed to me that if you have protests without this kind of anger or resentment, I mean, in the original Hieronymy article, it's protest coupled with resentment, that sometimes these cases just don't seem to rise to the level of blame. But the deeper question is, why do you really need that? Do you need blame here as opposed to just a kind of effective response to wrongdoing? And maybe the whole blame stuff, shmame, whatever it is, that's maybe irrelevant to the project.
Yeah, maybe that's right. Okay, good. Yeah, so in the end, how much do we care about words by contrast with conceptions? And I suppose that I could just subtract the word blame and right, say, hey, we have a moral protest view of, and then make up another word as you suggested. Yeah, so maybe that's right. Maybe that's right. Do I really, to what extent do I really want to push the view that you can have blame without anger? I don't think that all moral protest. So what about, here's a position. You can have the view that, look, not all moral protest counts as blame. But if moral protest is sufficiently confrontational, even if it doesn't involve anger, it counts as blame. That's a possibility. So one difference between what I'm calling blame and what the parents do in your example, the kids running through the house, is that they don't present reasons for not behaving, the moral reasons for not behaving that way. So that would be a difference. But then you can still argue, even if you present reasons for not behaving in that particular way in the future, it doesn't really count as blame if it's not confrontational, and it's not really confrontational if it doesn't involve anger. I guess I want to say that there are certain kinds of confrontational ways of calling people out that don't involve anger. I think people do it all the time in institutional contexts. You ever think about the kind of blame that goes on at the administrative level among faculty? I think it often doesn't, and it's confrontational, but it doesn't involve anger because it's not the sort of thing that people actually get angry about. But I think at least given my understanding of the term blame, counts as blame, but maybe it's not worth fighting for the word, as you suggest.
So I have the anger without the blame. Just kidding. Not really. It's probably true. Manuel.
Hi, Dirk. Thanks for the paper. So this is, I guess, two versions of one question, where the one question is something like, what do you think about the following distinction between the kind of roughly our conceptual commitments and our practical commitments? And so, here's the first form of the question. I guess I would have thought that they're kind of the two-tiered approach is trying to preserve a set of conceptual distinctions, and its success or failure at preserving those set of conceptual distinctions is supposed to count in favor of the approach. So the point about the kind of sports analogy, which incidentally I used all the way back in 4 Views on Free Will, before I think Dennett was using it. So the sports analogy, part of that what that's supposed to show is that that these instrumental goods can settle the propriety conditions, or if you like, the truth conditions on a certain kind of status, but there could still be further questions about whether to enforce the normative status. So it's a claim about what makes the status what it is. So you could think something like, look, in the responsibility case, what makes blameworthiness is it's a certain kind of status that plays a role in a practice that has a certain kind of justificatory shape. And so just as in a sports game, we can decide that something counts as a foul or a touchdown, et cetera, there's still a further question about whether or not we call it in a given instance or whether or not it's beneficial to call it in a given instance. But it's a claim about what makes it what it is. And so that's how I was understanding part of the function of the two-tiered approach. Is it's a proposal about how to capture some of the kind of the conceptual commitments one way or another. So I'm curious about whether or not you think, I guess, what you want to say about that, partly because I guess it partly connects up to the kind of the broader debates about conservatism versus not, because I think you're exactly right that the two-tiered account is going to bring with it a certain amount of conservatism. But there, I think, well, so on the plus side for the conservative, we get to retain a certain set of conceptual distinctions. And so it's true that there's, the teleological goods, that it might be less directly accessing those sorts of things. And so it's going to raise, I think, quite reasonable worries about the practice that maybe we can't solve just by pointing to something like, let's be careful not to blame in low social trust context, or let's double down on forgiveness or whatever. There might be ways in which the two-tiered theorists can earn back some of the worries. But I think, the basic worry that you've raised, I think, persists. But I guess I would have thought, like, the way out isn't just going to be settled by how the two-tiered view does, but it's also going to be settled by how the one-tier view does. So it looks like the single view, is asking us to give up on desert talk. It's asking us to give up on distinctions between deserving something and the benefits of doing something. It's imposing massive intellectualization demands where blame ascriptions become super cognitively costly. We have to sit and calculate those kinds of things. And, it's like maybe in some cases impossible to settle forward-looking assessments in the same way in which you can just replicate across sports context. Like, suppose we just said, well, look, this is crazy that we have two-tiered sports rules and statuses about fouls. Let's just get rid of that. Let's just ask in a given instance, that for a candidate for a foul, like, does it benefit the players to call it? And does it, keep the flow of the game going and make it strategically interesting? And that just imposes massive consequences on the participants, the observers and the participants, in a way that I'd be curious about how you think your version of the view dodges those kinds of worries.
Yeah, so I want to distinguish between a forward-looking view and a kind of maximizing consequentialist view. I think that there is a problem for maximizing consequentialist views that require calculation, but the kind of forward-looking view that I advance isn't a maximizing consequentialist view. Like, for example, in the view about punishment, and this is partly an answer to John's question as well. I mean, what I invoke in punishment is self-defense. I basically follow the Daniel Farrell view, according to which treatment of criminals isn't justified on the basis of consequential considerations, but rather on the basis of the right to self-defense and defense of others. So that's a bit different. But the point you make about, like, the conceptual distinction is cool. But so I think I can endorse that. So I want to push back. First of all, it's just recapping what I just said, that I don't think that the intellectual, given that the view isn't a maximizing consequentialist view, I don't think it's subject to the massive intellectual demands worry. So, I mean, the example I gave of Athena the parent. So Athena the parent doesn't blame because it maximizes good consequences, but rather, I mean, she's the Kantian mom after all. I mean, she blames because she believes it's her duty as a parent to morally educate her children and to morally educate her children in some context through what now? So here I suppose this would be the concept of blame that doesn't invoke desert. One, it points out to the child that what he's done is wrong. It specifies a moral reason for behaving differently in the future, and it's confrontational to a certain extent, right? So there we have an account of blame. I think that's not consequentialist, but also doesn't invoke desert. So, so that's a different way of answering the conceptual question that that you want to answer, that Manuel wants to answer through the notion of desert. So I guess in defense of my kind of big project, I think that the conceptual question as to what blame is can be responded to adequately without invoking the notion of desert.
Perfect. So Paul, you're up. Your hand works.
Finally, I'm learning as I go. Thank you, Thomas, in the first place for setting this up. This is great, and thanks, Dirk, for a really interesting talk. I got a whole bunch of things I'd like to ask, but I'm kind of thinking, Dirk, that among the various remarks you made, that were sort of tweaking my interest was the stuff about Hume and the kind of Humean skepticism about skepticism, as it were, if I can put it that way. But I'm also kind of combining that a little bit with some thoughts about some Freudian thoughts. I think I'm better versed on Hume than Freud, but if I can try and synthesize that, what I'm thinking of here is something like, you know, Hume is worried about over-intellectualizing human nature, as you know. And so when you say about how malleable is human nature, Hume is actually, and people, I think Strawson as well, are super sensitive to the fact that human nature is highly malleable and culturally very variable. So the concern might be more not are we malleable or variable, but just how far can we go with that? So I'm thinking of this, Dirk, and I'm kind of interested in what your response to this is from the point of view of psychological health, if I can put it this way. There's a kind of denialism about what we're actually like that certain kinds of idealistic projects encourage that can raise alarm bells for people. So one might be something like the Christian antipathy to sex, to see all sexuality as sin, just to use that as a kind of Freudian point of entry. So the worry is that, of course, our sexual practices and our practices about marriage and things like that vary a great deal. But given what human beings are like, we can't pretend that we're not sexual beings, and that has something that every society has to find some way of, some set of norms and practices to deal with that and cope with that, although it's obviously from everybody's point of view highly variable. But if you try to repress it, and it could be said that some societies, like say some forms of Christianity do that, one objection to it that's a forward-looking objection is that it's unhealthy because it leads to a certain kind of repression and denialism. So that it's not just that it's unrealistic because it over-intellectualizes human nature, but it's unrealistic because it actually relates to sort of troubling forms. This maybe channels some of John's concerns as well about what human beings can actually possibly be like. And it asks us to, as it were, detach from our kind of deepest nature in some form or other. And if I'm not going on too long, just to give you an example, if this helps a little bit, I'm over in Europe right now and I'm listening to the British news. There's a case, I don't know if it made its way over to North America much, but there's a case of a London policeman who basically arrested a woman and raped and murdered her. So there's this huge outrage in Britain right now about that case. There have also been cases where there are people who are mentally ill, where we've become more sensitive to those people, and people are quite still outraged at a horrible murder, but it requires sort of getting the society to be more sensitive and sophisticated in their response. But if I understand your project, it's that it's going to assimilate all these cases to something like the case of the mental illness, that we kind of see everybody as we're a subject of treatment, who we kind of, in some sense, the worry is that we kind of dehumanize them and we don't draw these distinctions that seem very significant to us now. And that, from one point of view, seems unrealistic, and from another point of view, seems quite unhealthy. So I wonder what you make of that kind of package of worries.
Yeah. Okay, so on the very last thing, so I've always pushed back against the Strawson's duality between the objective view and the participant view, as he characterizes it. So I also reject the objective view. It's not as if we should view everyone as a proper object of treatment and management, but rather I think that, and I think this is the key point that I've made really back in 2001, is that my view is completely consistent with regarding people as reasons responsive. So we don't think of them as objects of treatment, but as responders to reasons. And even my view of blame, the moral protest view of blame, what blame does, in my view, is to present the offender with reasons to behave differently, and so engages the offender's reasons responsiveness. So, it's a middle view. So I reject the Straussonian duality between, his characterization of the participant stance and objectivity of attitude. But look, the issue, the first issue you raised is, it's kind of one of the biggest issues in human life. You see problems in human life and the way people interact with one another, and you have some hypothesis about the causes of that problem and how it can be rectified. And then what do you do? The thing is that, one stance is to say that, we don't want to change anything, because after all, if we change anything, then people will start repressing and they'll be psychologically unhealthy. I don't know. Look, there are some cases in which it looks as if, take the certain kind of Marxist view that all kind of self-interested economic behavior is due to social structures. So if you get rid of the social structures, if you change them, then you get rid of the self-interest human behavior. Look, we've had some experiments. People say they weren't pure experiments. We had some experience with communism, sort of thing, but it looks like the self-interested economic behavior persisted despite the change in social structures. So there you want to say, hey, maybe there's something in human nature that can't be eradicated. And maybe the sexuality example, that's another good example. And I would side with you on that, as against certain kind of cults or whatever that were completely anti-sexual. But in this kind of case, but if you look at what we're considering now, like kind of diminishing the retributive stance. We have diminished the retributive stance over the past 100 years. The thing is, we used to blame people for being mentally ill, for being depressed, for certain kinds of weird, and we still do this. When people are weird, we blame them for being weird. But we do, I think, less of that in general now than we did in the past. But it's not as if this has resulted in unhealthy repression, right? We're able to accommodate this diminution of the retributive stance. And I think it's an open question. Going back to John's question, to John's point, I think it's an open question whether if we kind of eliminate retributive measures in punishment, whether closure can never be achieved for kind of victims and families of victims. There are proposals for other ways of doing it. Like I mentioned, Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. I mentioned, the Netherlands and Norway. We have to look at these cases and see if they work. We can't just assume out of hand that, if we reject the retributivist stance, then closure can't be achieved. And we've got social experiments happening in certain parts of the world that are at least going to give us relevant information as to whether that view is the right one. Right? So I agree with you. In some cases, like in the sexuality cases you mentioned, it's pretty clear that the views of some of these Christian cults would result in unhealthy repression. I think that in the case of economic self-interest, it turns out I think that the Marxists were wrong, and that certain kinds of social experiments that we've seen over the past 100 years indicate that. But I do think that elimination of the retributive stance, whether it has the bad results that John pointed to, I don't know what the answer to that question is. And we've got social experiments going on in certain parts of the world that will help us answer that question.
Thanks.
So Chad, I'll just say this to everybody. So Chad is a psychology professor here at the College of Charleston, where I'm at. And it just turns out that he was teaching a seminar and the honors program this semester on free will and science. And I was teaching a 300 level class in the philosophy department. class on free will. So we are sort of back and forth about these issues. So I'm happy that he's here. So go ahead, Chad, ask the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas, for organizing this, and thanks, Dirk, for a great talk. So coming from the perspective of a behavioral psychologist who was trained in the Skinnerian tradition, there's a few of us left, but this idea of the backfire effect, reminds me very much of Skinner's warnings about the use of punishment to control behavior. And also, one of his colleagues, Murray Sidman's book, Coercion and its Fallout. And you see this, as a parent of young kids, I see this all the time. Parents without a forward-looking view, they yell at their kids as if that's going to do anything. And ultimately, oftentimes that just increases the rate of the problem behavior, or worse, can escalate into corporal punishment that gets modeled, et cetera. And so this is an obvious case of the backfire effect. But to me, and I guess leading to my question, the problems with the use of punishment, whether we're looking at it from a backward perspective or a forward-looking approach, they seem fundamental. And they might not even involve anger or blame or even language, because you can demonstrate a backfire effect in a pigeon. And so I guess my question is, from a forward-looking utilitarian perspective, in what sense can we ever justify the use of punishment outside of, societal self-defense reasons? Is that the only case? Now, you mentioned blame might serving as a way to either enhance motivation or bringing people into contact with other ways to behave. And I possibly could see that, but I think if we're going to use these aversive consequences, even in a forward-looking approach, there should be a pretty high bar, because to date, they just don't appear to be very effective and generate a lot of counter control or the backfire effect. So I'm just wanting your thoughts on, in a forward-looking utilitarian approach, are there ways beyond self-defense to justify the use of punishment?
Okay, great. So I used to think not. So in 2001 and 2014, I think I was opposed to all punishment where punishment gets characterized as, the intentional infliction of harm for as a response to wrongdoing. But more recently, I've kind of been concerned about some of these, kind of political crimes and financial crimes, and that I'm thinking you might need punishment as deterrence there. So you might think that a lot of crime is due to, social, psychological deprivation. And there you might think that rehabilitative approaches are better. And to the extent that you need to protect people from folks like that, you use incapacitation, but incapacitation not conceived as punishment, but on the quarantine analogy. But if you think about, what about, financial crimes, for example, like, Wall Street crimes? I mean, basically people are motivated to get as close to violating the rules as possible, because you have a competitive advantage over the others, right? The others in your industry. And so what if you didn't have penalties for a violation of those rules? Like, what could you have? I mean, you could have incapacitation. You could take away these people's licenses, but that's in a way worse than the kinds of mild punishments that I'm envisioning. So I don't know. It seems to me that, at least in those kinds of cases, there's justification for certain kinds of punishments, not really harsh punishments, but punishments that would be effective at deterring that sort of behavior. And also in the political context, I mean, there's a lot of motivation to cheat in various ways in politics and bend the rules. What do you want to do? Maybe certain kinds of mild punishments would be effective deterrents here. You don't need really harsh punishments either. And there's a lot of evidence that just being on the record as having committed a crime, or even a modest monetary fine, that's not not particularly onerous relative to the person's economic circumstances, or certain kinds of cases, maybe really short jail terms like a month or two in jail, these can be very, very effective. And so, I mean, I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that you have to do something about, political crime and financial crime, this sort of thing. And it's hard to, I don't know if there's a good solution to these kinds of problems other than some general punishment as general deterrence.
We could give guillotines a try, and not because they deserve it. All right. So there were two. Hannah still had a question. Her hand was the next in queue, so I'm going to see what she says. I already told Jonah on the side he's got a question as well, but I promised that I would try to get Dirk out here at 5:30. So I've got Jonah's questions in the queue, and I'll make sure I send them to you, Dirk, in case you're curious to see what other people thought. Okay, perfect. Yes. So Hannah, and that'll be the end of the. I'll say a few words, and then that'll be it. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the great talk and for organizing this. Looking forward to getting the book. I just had a question about in what sense blame gives a moral reason to its targets. So I was thinking of expressions of anger from this confrontational stance that function as kind of threats or sanctions or demands for reparations. Like these kinds of expressions of blame or expressions of emotions seem like they give reasons to their targets to change their behavior, because if they don't, they're going to get sanctioned. But they don't seem like they rise to the level of moral reasons, since we can imagine giving those exact kinds of reasons in non-moral context or for non-moral reasons. So is the sense in which these are moral reasons that what grounds them or what justifies us in expressing these forms of anger are moral reasons, or is the morality built into the emotion itself? I was just wondering what you had to say about that.
So this part of my account of blame is revisionary relative to our practice. So I think that at least in the standard case, when you blame somebody, you should specify the moral reason for refraining from the behavior at issue. So I'm not saying that all behavior that we call blame and is naturally called blame actually does this. And I think he gives some nice examples of this, but I think that this should be done. I think this is, at least on my own view, this is a very important function of blaming people, providing them with moral reasons to behave differently. Now, this harks back in part to my answer to Paul, right? I don't want to take the Straussonian objective point of view with respect to people. So people aren't there to be managed. You can manage people by yelling at them and not giving them reasons, but you have to respect, this is the Kantian side of my view, you have to respect them as reasons responsive agents. And the way you do that in blaming is you present them with reasons to refrain from the sort of behavior at issue. Okay, so this is a revisionary account of blame. I think that what you described, we call that blame, but I don't think it's the right kind of blame, because I think that blame has to give reasons.
Okay, well, I said 5:30 and we were right at 5:30. So that's probably a good place to bring it to an end. So thanks again to Dirk for coming. That was amazing. Thanks to everybody else. I mean, seriously, it was I don't know if you looked around to see who all was here, but it was it's a great group of people showed up, and not just from here. There are people from South America, Brazil, people that I know down there. So I'm thrilled with how it turned out. Let me just say this, that's part of why I hope this has a way of turning into something that lasts longer than the blogs, because if people are feeling like they constantly have to contribute to all these posts and know what's being saying when, you get tired of doing it, it wears you down. Whereas we only have to pull together as a group 3 times, a semester, and this can be something. I think it could be something very useful and also pleasant. This is a tremendous amount of fun for me to be able to listen to this stuff. So thanks again, John. You had a quick question.
He didn't.
Well, actually, I tried to applaud, but
I see.
I'm sorry, but now that I have the floor, yes. Yeah. One of the challenges with the Garden of Forking Paths was that we just got burnt out, and people kept expecting responses, and it became exhausting. And as you pointed out, it was hard to get the people that we wanted to post, and sometimes difficult to get the people that we didn't want to post not to post. So I commend you for this idea, which seems to solve all those problems.
I hope so. Really, it would be like just seeing all of you. Like, I've seen a lot of you in person before, but just seeing you all here for this is great. Hopefully, now I do the next one. The thing at 1 o'clock. I wish Christian's was not at 1 Eastern Standard Time. I realize that is like suboptimal, but he's in Berlin right now, and so like, I don't know how and he's got kids, so like young kids, so it's like hard to get him to do it much later than what would be 7 or 8 o'clock his time. So that's just going to have to be the case, but I'll record all of them. They'll be online if you see what it is, so you can participate in the discussion afterwards. I'll stick around for a couple minutes. If people have questions for me, you can ask them. Otherwise, thanks again. I'll send an announcement around, but I'll post the recording as I said I would, and there'll be a blog post for those of you who I have a couple questions that I'd like to discuss with people. So I'll post those tomorrow too. So if anyone wants to participate in the discussion thread, that'll also start tomorrow on the blog. And thanks again. It was great. So I appreciate it.
Let me thank all of you for showing up. That was great. I'm grateful for your interest, and also I want to thank you for all the wonderful questions and comments.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks. Jonah, yeah, do you have a question? No? Oh, you could. Yeah, we're fine. The great depopulation starts. Seriously, Dirk, that was amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay.
I'm so excited that you were able to do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah,
That was
next time around.
fantastic. It was really fun.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no worries. Michael, it's great to see you. I'm glad you got to make it.
Great to see you too. Yeah, sorry I
Yeah.
didn't participate. Everybody, there were enough good questions. So
Hey,
No,
Michael, you already participated in the writing of the book.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was fun too. I thought it was pretty constructive. So,
Oh, good. I hope we can do something like this every time.
Super.
bye-bye, everybody.
Have a good one.
Okay.
Eddie, what you got? I'm glad it was good to see you. It was good to see you though.
I was just trying to see if we would end up being the last two people and we could catch up a little.
Yeah, we can do that in a second. I think so. Gabriel, he's someone I've worked with or interacted with from Brazil. And so, yeah, sorry, Gabriel, I got your email. If I'd known that, I would have gone and grabbed it. I was so pressed for time.
No problem. I was full of questions to Dirk, but I mean, there's a queue, there's a line.
Yeah. Well, so here's
I think maybe for the next session, you could extend a little bit more. I had questions for him about something at among the same lines of Chad. I think all his proposal kind of tracks back to the idea of Skinner and learned helplessness and behaviorism, but it connects also with a kind of a denial of a Strawson perspective, Strawsonian perspective as well. There's a lot of issues we could discuss, but I think it's it was a great talk, and I'm glad that I was able to hear it. But I'll really suggest to make it a little bit longer to give more room for debate.
Yeah, the problem
still
is
have questions,
Yeah, but so here's the difficulty. If I ask people to give me more than an hour and a half of their time, they just won't do it because they're not getting paid for this. He did that just to help me and help this community. So the more I ask for people, the harder it is. Yeah. The way to think about it is if the blog thing works like I hope it will, and it may be Dirk isn't the sort who wants to participate in the blog, which is fine, but some speakers will. And then it's true you didn't get a chance to ask the question, but you can ask the question on the blog, and then I don't know, you and I can even discuss what we think about the question you had. So I'm hoping that happens. I mean, if it doesn't, that's fine, but that's part of what I'm hoping for. Like I said,
it makes sense.
I can't expect everyone to contribute to the blog, all the speakers, but that's the goal. And because that cost them less time than another 30 minutes, that was my worry. We could have gone a little longer today because I had to introduce everything, which I won't always have to do, but in any event, but you said you wanted to meet maybe next week or something to talk about the stuff you got going on. Let's do that.
Exactly. We can discuss that. I mean, within a month, it's
okay. No, that's fine. We can do it. We can do it next week.
Great. See you guys. Bye-bye.
Good. Thanks
for the great talk and the great project that I think will gather people to discuss great subjects. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks.
We always say we're going to call each other, and then we never did.
Yeah, that's the way it works. Let me make sure you record on me for, yeah, so it's not recording.
The only, by the way,